welcome everybody to our February edition of the SLA CIC Communities Learning Series. My name is Liz Frickleton with Aurora WDC. And we've been a longtime sponsor of the CIC and participant and supporter of SLA. So thankful that you're here and joining this vibrant community to take some time to learn something new today. I've brought two Canadians together. I'm really excited about this duo, and they've got a really dynamic concept of making the case today about why intelligence is well positioned to empower stakeholder capitalism. Before we get into it with Jonathan and Jim, and I hand over the mic to Jim for introductions, I just want to go over the housekeeping things, so we're going to be, we've started recording of this. There will be a replay link sent to you via email following this webinar, or if you're joining us asynchronously, welcome. And please use the chat. We really love the dynamic conversation and dialogue throughout. So let's keep going here. So coming up, I want to highlight a couple things for us. So we did just get an email, several of you that are following along with SLA Corporate and are thinking about as CI and Info Pros wanting to contribute to the annual conference, the conversation and the thought leadership there. There is the session proposal. The call for those is still open. Actually, they just extended it 5 days. So you've got until the 27th. So what is that? This Sunday. So ideas, I know, take time. Proposals take a little time. So you've got an extension there. And then next month in March, I don't know if any of you have been following along with Zena Applebaum, Phil Britton, and Elise Knuckles. I have been putting together the practical guide. It is how to do CI, or as they like to say, how to do your job and not get fired. So I'm really excited for this group of folks coming in March. So if you, and just a housekeeping note, if you did register for this event with Jonathan and Jim, you're automatically signed up. That's why you saw that March 30th date on the registration. So we've set it up as a series. So once you're registered once, you don't have to do that again. With that being said, we know these are our wonderful panelists and today, but I just want to encourage you, if you're a Twitter user, grab that hashtag CIC webinar, put that at the front end, back end, wherever in your tweet, and we can continue the conversation there. So as a reminder, I just had the pleasure of contacting the person who won last month, but your name's in a hat to win $25 just by being here on your lunch to learn something new. So that's a cool benefit as well. I think that's all I have, Jim. So if you want to come off mute, and I'm going to go ahead to the bio slide and I'll hand it over to you. Thank you both for being here, and thank you audience as well.
Excellent. Yeah, so it's great to be here from the Great White North, as we have two Canadians here. Jonathan is coming to us from Moncton, New Brunswick, and I am in Ottawa, Ontario, where we have no more trucker protests, so that's a good thing. If you have anyone watching, I can't believe we made international news with that. Anyhow, Jonathan Dunnett is the CEO of Enable Leaders, and he is also the program manager for Venn Innovations. If you have a chance, take a look at Enable Leaders, because it's an excellent source of resources on leadership and insights. It's enableleaders.com. It's great. Jonathan has been working in a multitude of different fields. I'm not going to read his bio because you can read yourself. And Jonathan is one of the great in the whole idea around the stakeholder capitalism piece. And he was one of the people that connected me with that, along with Craig Fleischer. And I think this is a great topic for us. And Jonathan's going to lead us through today with a great presentation on intelligence and stakeholder capitalism. So on that note, take it away.
Stop sharing here so we can switch screens.
Perfect. And can you see my screen okay?
Yep, we'll just need slideshow mode.
Yes, great point. Technology is great, isn't it? All right. So Jim, by the way, as was mentioned earlier, love to have this to be interactive. With the setup, Jim is going to watch and the Aurora team is going to watch in the comments. And so they'll flag things as appropriate, and otherwise looking forward to a great discussion. Thank you to SLA and to the folks at Aurora and all the other stakeholders who brought me here today. And thank you to Jim as well for being part of this discussion. Really looking forward to it. So I want to start today by just talking and putting a little bit of a frame around this. And I truly do believe we are at very much a pivotal moment. As you're seeing nowadays, we're going to talk about a few examples, but really everyone's business has stakeholders that are active and moving. And that is a really dynamic picture. And that, of course, comes with risks. And from my perspective, what I see evolving is there's some different lenses, whether we're talking about ESG or stakeholder capitalism, but in nature, they're generally heading in the same direction. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through this. Short-termism, I think we're all sort of familiar with the plight and issues of that. But really, if we're not thinking about this from a longer perspective, I do really think that's a path to failure. And of course, my fourth point here, why are we all here? I think there's a huge opportunity for all of us to help smooth the path for better organizations and in turn, a better world. And lastly, we're going to touch on this a couple of times, but I think paramount to all of this is the discussion in tandem with the insights and intelligence element of this that we need to be having as organizations is truly defining what is our North Star, what is acceptable, what do we want to be as an organization, what are those outcomes, and then how does the impact or the actions of stakeholders begin to intersect with that, and how can we use this North Star as an element to make better decisions more quickly and effectively. So briefly, why am I talking about this? Why am I interested in this topic? I think more and more as we're seeing with recent issues, we are really dealing with a time of great change. And I think the stakeholder element of business is only becoming more and more active. And I think if we do this right, there's an opportunity to have really positive impact from both an organizational perspective as well as the perspective of being humans and just the longevity of the human race in some of these cases. Anyway, we'll explore that a little bit more, but I truly do believe finally that the actions that we take over the next few years, as little as 2, 3, 4, 5 years, this is going to set the pace for the next 100 years. And there's a lot of important decisions that we're being faced with. I'll just pause there. Was there a question? Any questions so far?
No questions so far.
Okay, super. I'm going with one screen today, folks. So pardon the interruption. But so I wanted to quickly touch on a story. So my parents recently bought a stove, and it turned out in the end that the cost was actually prohibitive to have it repaired versus to buy a new one. I think it was like $1,000 to have it repaired, and it was going to be $800 or something to buy new. And from my perspective, that's really problematic. And there's some impacts here, which there's a lot of stakeholders involved in this stove. So that could be from the factory worker to government with trade agreements, small businesses. Obviously, they were dealing with my folks. We're dealing with elements of resources here as well, where that stove, with the exception of that one part, was good. And there was a lot of resource intensive efforts that went into creating that stove. And now it's just being discarded to slowly be broken down. And so as we start to consider this, again, this is only one very small transaction, but you can see there's quite a widespread of impacts here when we're talking about a stove. And you might say, well, it's just a stove. What does that matter? And the the thing is, yes, my parents bought a stove, but if you start to think about and consider, every day consumers are making choices. And this has really been our sort of de facto operating system since World War II. And the choices that we make as organizations and the choices that we make as consumers, whether in a B2C or a B2B context, those all have impacts. And so my question here is there a better way? And I'll pass it over to Jim here, who's going to bring us to our first focus question.
Okay, so sorry, technical difficulties. So the first question has, what stakeholders are relevant for your business today? And I think this is important that everyone be aware of that. And then is the answer the same for 10 years from now, or what about 10 years ago? So, you know, as Jonathan mentioned, there is significant change and it's rapid, and you know, the VUCA world is I always like to look at. So these are important questions to take a look at.
Yeah, and just to note, we will come back to this later, but if you want to start interacting with that in the chat, I certainly welcome that as well. Thank you, Jim. So we're going to pivot here slightly and talk about the systems element of this and how that all comes together. So I think what's happening and what we're seeing largely in the market is really this shift from pure sort of shareholder capitalism, which, you know, I recently saw that Tim Cook is up for compensation of, I think it was 1,400 times the average worker at Apple. And Apple workers, of course, are well compensated for their work. But we're seeing a shift. We're seeing a wider lens starting to be applied. And so again, whether it's from a pure stakeholder capitalism lens, and we'll talk about that more in a moment, or sort of some of these ESG metrics that are coming, it seems like the world is clear from a trend perspective, at least, on where it's going. And so for those of you who might be unfamiliar with the term stakeholder capitalism, really a few things I want to highlight, but it's really a holistic picture. It's about long-term value creation. It's looking at all stakeholders and then society at large in terms of the implications. So again, you can appreciate the shift from pure shareholder capitalism, where all we care about is how do we do this quarter, to starting to think through some of these more broad implications. And as you may or may not have seen, there's a lot of noise right now in this space. And I think we're really far from what this is going to be, but you have some smart folks who are saying we must standardize this, that's the way forward. And then on the other side, you have some very smart folks in their own rights who are saying that's a terrible idea. And both come up with seemingly good rationale as to why that should be the case. So you've got folks like the World Economic Forum, MSCI, Refinitiv. You could probably have a full-time job just keeping track of different folks that are bringing metrics forward. And they all sort of have their own version of this. And again, we just don't know where this is going to end, but it seems clear on where the conversation is going. And so as you look forward and consider for your organization, a lot of this is going to have to be contextualized for your organization, what makes sense. Now you might say, well, you know, this sounds really familiar. Isn't this the triple bottom line all over again? And that would be a very fair point to bring something like that up. Interestingly, this was picked up from John Elkington about 4 years ago now, talking in HBR, and his whole desire of this, he was the originator, was really systems change. And what we saw happen in the market, of course, was it became more of an accounting tool. And so Elkington's argument, as you can see at the bottom here, is that it's really time that we need to make a change or get out of the way. And so obviously his efforts to bring about change stalled, but time and place and context mean something. And Clearly, again, from my perspective, at least of the world, from when he created this in the late 90s to now, the world is significantly different. And yes, the accountants are coming. No disrespect to any accountants. I have many of them in my life that I love. But one of the elements that we're seeing is a really interesting doubling down of all of a sudden the big four at all are becoming experts, of course, in ESG. And I would give a word of caution. Beware of somebody that calls themselves an ESG expert. I don't profess to be an expert in this space by any means, but the people that do have really good credibility from my perspective, they keep saying this over and over. This is not dissimilar to what we've seen in the market with diversity and inclusion over the last number of years, where all of a sudden everybody was a diversity and inclusion expert. And so I think we have to be really careful from an intel and insights perspective. If somebody comes in as a white knight with their herald flying and saying, I'm here to save you, I'm the ESG expert, take that with a grain of salt, because these are all highly specialized domains. And particularly as you try to look at your insights and intelligence programs from this lens, you have to set yourself up for success. And if you set it up poorly due to bad influence out of the gate, obviously that's going to be really problematic.
I think just a second there, I was add to that is from the ESG standpoint, we hear a lot about ESG investing and the investment part of it, not so much about sort of strategy component of it. So there's a lot of investment pieces, but not. So it's more of a stock play or markets play versus the strategy play. So I think that taking those two pieces into consideration is fairly important too when people say that they're an ESG expert. So.
Yes, that's a great point. And again, I think it's important to delineate, as you're saying, Jim, exactly what are we talking about? What are these people bringing to the table? Because again, if you're using them as a key point of feeding your intel and insights perspective, you have to be really careful and clear. So moving on to the shift. So you might be saying, well, why do I care? And this might be a thing where maybe it's on a personal level, you have aversion to this, maybe you're dealing with some corporate challenges, whatever it may be. But I think it's one of those things where the trend in the market, at least from my perspective, seems very clear that this is where the world is going. And it seems like the market wants responsible companies. Now, there is, of course, a say-do gap. That is a real thing. In some cases where, if we talk about green consumers as an example, sometimes there is a say-do gap between, yes, I want to buy environmentally friendly products, and, oh, you mean it's $100 more? Well, I'll just stick with the existing. But I do think largely from the work that I've been doing, again, this seems very clear that the market is shifting to want more responsible companies. And even just this week, I hope you enjoy this picture of Ronald McDonald, or the character, as much as I did. Carl Icahn has been caught up in the news. I don't know if you saw this or not, but he holds 200 shares of McDonald's, so fairly nominal in terms of a shareholder, but he wants to bring on 2 board members. And he's calling McDonald's current practices obscene when it comes to pigs. The pig was pretty cute too, so I thought I'd put that picture in. But and McDonald's is firing back. So this is a really very public example of some stakeholder dynamism, where why would we expect reasonably that Carl Icahn, who only holds 200 shares, is going to start creating a lot of noise for us? We wouldn't necessarily think of that. However, that's something you have to be aware of from an organizational perspective. And to that end, I think really this is a key point for me, that if we fail to think ahead and consider what can happen, like this example with Icahn, it might blow over, it might not be a big deal at the end of the day, but certainly this is distracting them from their core business. And I think we have to be really careful to help mitigate that potentially crippling noise that can come from shareholders if we're not thinking ahead. And again, what helps us with that is this idea of the North Star, where again, what's our corporate purpose? What are our corporate values to give us a decision lens to quickly filter something to say yes, no, or let's investigate further. And I think that's really key for us as insights and intel professionals.
Yeah, and I think the other thing with that too is, just to go back to the sort of the beginning, in the short-termism versus long-termism is also a key component to that too, right? So you're looking at the North Star as from a long-term perspective, which is much more important, and to look at from that standpoint.
Absolutely, great point. Now, there's a lot of indicators. This is just a very small grouping of some things that I have seen. So whether you're looking at things like generational differences, everybody's been talking about the Great Resignation, the cadence of people quitting jobs just in the US alone over the last 12 months has been just, I think it's millions a month, if I'm not mistaken. So there's really an incredible cadence of that. That's a stakeholder group that we need to have insights on. Jim touched earlier on some of the private capital elements and what's happening in ESG assets. There's some tremendous numbers there. When we look at things like global warming, fires, floods, and even orientation of companies themselves, pardon me. One of the things I'll zone in on here particularly is the number of B Corps. And so there are over 4,000 B Corps. I was part of a session yesterday even where I think 2 companies who are quite small have already gone that way as well. So again, we're seeing indicators of a shift in that market. And so as we look forward with this, what is that way forward? If we buy into this whole premise, what are we going to do then? And I did make a PG version of this, so we'll stick with shoot. But your oh shoot moments can really show value for insights and intelligence. And I think when we're talking about this element of stakeholders, that's so vitally important. And I picked this quote up from Stan probably about 6 to 8 months ago. And this is so key that we have to get a seat at the table. And the way that you can do that is by bringing these moments forward where people around the table are saying, oh, shoot, yeah, we need to know that. We need to action that. And we have to be able to create that buy-in. And that's so pivotal. I think one of the laments that I've seen within the insights and intel community is, well, we do all this great work, but nobody listens. And certainly there is responsibility within leadership for that. Sometimes people just don't want to listen, don't care to listen. But I think as much as possible, we also have a role to play in that, where we can generate influence and bring forward those meaningful moments to demonstrate our credibility to executive leadership. And really, this is all about, at the end of the day, we need to create value, but you can't do that if you're 5 rows over and just shouting at people. You have to have a seat at the table, and that's really pivotal. Jim, hand it over to you for focus question 2.
So this, I think, is perhaps one of the greatest questions in this whole piece, because do you have a seat at the table currently? If yes, what opportunities do you see presented through ESG stakeholder capitalism? And if no, how are you going to change that? And I think the key to this is the sort of if no, because I think in far too many times people don't know who should be at the table. And the key is to getting people at the table and having the right people around the table to go to the sort of core of stakeholder capitalism and having all of your stakeholders at the table. So in that sense, it's also a bit of push and shove on the you as a stakeholder working, fighting your way, clawing your way to get us to the table, but as also the company or organization that says, hey, we need these people at the table. So it's a bit of hitting that balance is key, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to build on that, I would suggest it's, again, where we can really add tremendous value, because we need to be able to separate signal from noise. And so does it make sense to bring, if we talk about employees as a stakeholder group, do we need to hear from 3,000 or could we talk to 30? Obviously, that's far reaching in terms of size, scope, what we're trying to understand. Thanks for that, Jim. So again, if we need a seat at the table, what else do we need to do? And we've touched on elements of this a little bit already, but we really need to get key decision makers aligned. We need to get their buy-in, and we need to help them understand this landscape. And I think this is a conversation for some organizations that's becoming easier, especially those that maybe have felt the pain of a stakeholder incident, for lack of a better term, where you look at like Spotify and Joe Rogan. There is a real visceral example of a company that the CEO seemed okay with their North Star, and yet, behind closed doors, it'd be interesting to ask them the questions of, do we truly have alignment on what we need and where we're going? And secondly here, really, insights and intel can feed the system and the organization, both from an anticipatory framework as well as on the back end. And we'll touch a little bit more on that further along. Now, of course, look, there are going to be challenges, absolutely. And you may have things that are not on my list, even in terms of challenges that you're thinking through from your own context. These were a few ideas, certainly, that I came up with. But we look at short-termism, which we've already talked about. We talk about doubt of intent. It's very easy to be a cynic these days. And I think this is one of those challenges where you're only going to be as good as your last at bat. And because really, from a reputational risk perspective, you have to hold that consistent line. Challenges of intel practices. Jim used the term VUCA earlier. When the world is moving faster and faster every day, the cadence only continues to increase for us. So we need a way to, whether it's through technology, humans, or both, to create a system that makes sense. And coupled with that as well is connecting with stakeholders. So we touched on the employee example earlier. How are you going to do that? How are you going to define success? How are you going to make this manageable for people? And then how are we going to coordinate intel flows and coordination? That's going to be a big challenge. And then finally, items not within your control. And we'll touch on that. I'll just pause there, Jim. Any questions coming up? Oh, you're on mute.
Yes, I have that. So we do have a couple of questions, actually. One question from Derek Johnson. It says, it's been said that intelligence is more about asking the right questions versus having all the answers. In the Tim Cook compensation example, so go back to the Tim Cook compensation example, what are the right questions to ask to drive intelligence, either supporting or refuting his compensation package being 1,400 times the average worker? And when you think about his charge as the CEO being focused on creating stakeholder value, so sort of what are the right questions? And then as a publicly held company, that view of stakeholder value could then occasionally singularly focus on stock price appreciation. So how do you say, okay, he's got all the mix together, right? So
yeah, so that'll be our next webinar. No, it's a great question, and so I'll do my best to address that, and I will come short. I will say that outright. I do think this is one of those issues where, again, you need to have a holistic alignment. So To the latter element of your question in terms of like shareholder returns, obviously, if shareholders are happy, Tim Cook is hitting his KPIs for compensation, it may be that everyone is happy. I do think, and Jim could probably touch more on this from his background, but from a PR, reputation risk, comms perspective, 1,400 times is a really hard thing to digest. When I first started looking at this topic over a decade ago, it was around 300, 330 times was the average. And so when you continue to see creep with that, again, I think it's a great question for the North Star. What kind of question does Apple want to be? Excuse me, what kind of company does Apple want to be in terms of wealth and wealth distribution? That could be a real question. And so I think I would go back to the front end of that and saying, what is our North Star? What's our values and our purpose as a company? And are the actions that we're doing aligning with that? And so I think that's where I would end that, is really start at the beginning and say, where do we want to be? And are our actions aligning? And not just on compensation, but all of our actions. You look at Apple, earlier in the slide, actually, there were, Apple had asked the SEC about disclosures and was actively advocating for that. So, they're showing progress on that side. They've also come under fire for how they've treated their employees. There's some very public lawsuits. So again, I would go back to the North Star and the questions that surround that of who are we, what do we want to be as a company, and does this all align?
And just on that sort of thread as well, Richard Caldwell has a great point. He says in most cases, corporate values end up on the wall or a pocket card that people carry around with them, and people ignore them. And their real North Star is how they behave when times get tough.
Yes.
So that's when companies should really ink their values. And he uses the example of Boeing and the 737 MAX as an example. And I think that's the key, right? Because you can spout all you want about North Star and values and have these great statements, but when the shoot hits the fan, I'll use your PG version, that's when you really have to look at it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that that example with Boeing, Richard, thank you for that, is a really great example of, in some cases, bad behavior, misalignments, questionable ethics, perhaps. You'd probably be more familiar with than I am, but I think that again shows exactly the tension that you point out. It can't be about what's written on the wall. It's about what happens when nobody else is around and you don't think people are watching, and how you act and behave at that point at a base level. And then when you start adding stakeholder elements and stakeholder dynamism on top of that, where do you net out? Because if you don't have a stable base, I used an example before where it's easier to build pillars made of concrete than try to build pillars with butter as it's melting. Again, I think it's a great point.
Perfect.
All right, on we'll go. And feel free, if you have other questions, please drop them in the chat. Just to touch a little bit on the elements of the opportunities in response. So we've talked about the challenges, and now the other flip side of the coin. When we look at short-termism, I think, to me, at the end of the day, this really comes back to leaders making a conscious choice. And so, like the 737 example is a great one, where they were obviously thinking about how can we rectify, we have a software issue that caused, I think it was 2 crashes. Now we have this issue, lots of planes in the field. How are we going to fix that? What does our interaction look like with the FAA? I think now, obviously, they're on the other side of this seemingly, but I think it's so pivotal that short-termism really be identified for what it is, and then to the point that I think you made earlier, Jim, looking at the longer-term view and those conscious choices that we're going to be taking, not just what's on the wall, but again, how do we act? That's a really great opportunity. And I've got a few examples here of folks from Paul Pullman, Dan Price, and Dan Schulman, who are folks that have very clearly made commitments one way or another on being conscious. When we look at the doubt of intent, this is where I think going to be one of the key challenges in this domain. Pardon me. Be one of those key challenges in this domain because, of course, again, if your last at bat was a bunch of greenwashing or what is perceived to be greenwashing, that's going to really play havoc in terms of how you're viewed by stakeholders. And so I think it's so key that time and time again, your actions really back up your words. When we look at how we're going to connect with stakeholders, I think this is where technology can help us immensely. And not tech for tech's sake. I'm not a fan of that. I work with tech companies every day. To just throw technology at a problem doesn't work. And if you haven't lived and felt that pain before, try it. Actually, I don't recommend it. It doesn't work. And so again, this is pivotal as you're thinking about the systems that you have really look like from a systems thinking perspective or systems design perspective on how you can use technology to support ultimately what's important to you. And when we look back at success, that gives us easier elements in terms of reporting and analytics. And then more importantly, even I think is the flow of intel and the coordination piece. Because at the end of the day, with the amount of data that we have coming in, if we can't make it actionable and meaningful, that's going to be a real challenge. Then we look at items not within your control. And I think very simply, this is where if you currently don't have some sort of foresight or futures element within your processes, this is a really good opportunity. And to think about and consider how you can create early warning systems to set yourself up for success. Well, if we go back to the example of Icon and McDonald's, even with as much budget as they have, they might be looking at their shareholders going, well, he only has 200 shares. What's the likelihood that we could run into issues? However, if you look at his history of behavior, there may have been some indicators that the early warning might have been Carl Icahn just bought shares. So we need to get an understanding of that. If we were looking deeper, one of the drivers that BBC noted at least was Icon's daughter is actually an animal activist. So again, as we think about the concepts and work that we do of profiling to understand people, profiling to understand stakeholders, that again could represent a great example of this. So we've touched on the idea of systems. And so you might be saying, well, that's great, but is this being done? And so to find really great cogent examples, at least from a public perspective, was not, it's certainly maybe not ubiquitous. However, I did find this example from Unilever, which when you start to look at, again, from their systems perspective, it's fairly comprehensive. And of course, we know when we touched on earlier, the program that they've been running for over a decade now, that system has to have some sort of mechanism and support underneath it. And so I would postulate that that is, in fact, a good example. And McDonald's actually, they're doing a webinar next week with an organization. If you want to know what it is, I'll send me an email later. It's not SLA. So I won't talk about it too much, but their response to the pandemic has been a really great example of keeping up, not only keeping up with the tide, but really rising well above and being heavily successful. And so again, it appears as though they have a really good system for this. And so the question then comes to, is this really a huge shift? And I've plotted out a few sort of elements here when we think back to the stove. And I'd really make the argument this is more of it's a different lens. This is a recalibration of the things that we do already. But I think probably for some companies, whether you're an SME or a large enterprise, I think this is going to be an accelerant and an amplification of the things that you're currently monitoring to watch for. And at the end of the day, one of the things is you're ultimately going to have to make choices and perhaps weight those priority of stakeholders, because obviously there are some stakeholders that are going to have a heavier impact on the decisions that you make, and some will be a little bit lighter. Now, you might think, as an example, you might say, well, our employees are important, but they're not the ones that I would give the heaviest weight to. There's been some really great examples of even Google over the last couple of years has gotten rocked multiple times by employee groups and had a really significant business impact. So I think it's, again, important to really consider and think about in your context, not just the what do you think, but even perhaps building out scenarios to walk through what are those potential impacts. And folks that are more well-versed in stakeholder management and those sorts of disciplines, I'm sure can lend a bit more clarity to that.
Well, that's a great point, and I actually have you use Google as an example, and I have a question here. Just came in with around the service industry stakeholder point of view, where decision makers don't have much on the table to decide, but the consumers or the clients who they depend on do. So how does the decision maker anchor the questions that they have?
Maybe is there a little bit more context, even if the person wants to come off mute, perhaps?
Yeah,
that
would probably be the best way to do it if they're able to do that. I don't know if I can do that. Let me see if I can do that.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, my question to it is the coming wave, the insights what you're presenting to us, and noticing from a different worldview where they come in, that the service industry is taking the stride in very different ways. Though the consumers are the end users, they are also the impact users for the decision makers. On the other side, the service industry is dependent on the client's request or the client's need. So now the decision makers in between, how do we position themselves to see what you're presenting, to see what you're doing in their angle, to see the oh shoot movement or oh shoot moment, for them to see that the recalibration should be happening not after 10 years or after 5 years. It has to start now, and it has to kind of come eventually in helping the mood change and also the momentum change. So that's my question.
And so just so I'm clear, the two stakeholder groups that you're referring to are employees and customers on the other side. Is that correct?
That's right.
Okay. So I think whether we talk about a service business or whether we talk about a product-based business, actually just before this webinar, I was looking at a product-based company that was having some really interesting reaction to one of their new product features. They had integrated actually with a cryptocurrency platform, and there was a whole thread of users, presumably current users, replying, "I'm going to unsubscribe. I'm not aligned with this." So when we're looking at these stakeholder groups, we have to understand, number one, what's important to them. Number two, how are we going to measure that, and how are we going to think about it? So we talked earlier about the systemization, particularly of communication. So we need to think about that. So in more of a service-based business, you might be looking at things like review sites. So whether it's Yelp or Google My Business or Facebook reviews or those sorts of things, where we can seek out opportunities to understand more of the consumer perspective. We can also do that in real time as well. We can do things where we look at somebody as they're going through client experience. If you see somebody where they came in happy, but maybe they're upset all of a sudden, that might be a point as a manager where you go, sir, how can I help you today? Actually had a great interaction earlier with a service person who said, how can I make you smile today? I thought that was a fantastic question, where instantly it was disarming, because I may have had things that were more negative that I needed to deal with, but all of a sudden now I'm thinking about smiling. It was a great psychological approach. And so I think if we look to understand what's important to those consumers, and that's through a variety of information sources, we look for where we can gather that information, whether it's real time or asynchronous, and then we look to be reactive to that. On the flip side, particularly when you're dealing with employees, the same idea. So like Edwin, I know you've got a background in HR as an example. That's where things like pulse surveys can be handy, looking at people's body language, just doing regular managerial best practices of checking in on people and seeing how things are going. As you think about how to systemize that in a way for your organization that makes sense, again, I think that's where we can start to bring together both sides of that. So I hope that answers your question.
It does. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Jim, any other questions?
Not at the moment. Thanks. That's great.
All right. Well, we'll see if we can give a few minutes back, perhaps. So some closing thoughts. Really, I think there's an opportunity here for both Intel and Insights units, or if you're perhaps a solo practitioner, doesn't matter. I think there's a great opportunity for us to help lead the way across the organization and to truly get recognition of Intel and Insights and the value. So we always talk about the importance of accounting. We always talk about the importance of finance, HR, et cetera. Again, we need to have a seat at the table. And finally, as we just talked through that example, I think that's a really great one, where we have to talk about what does success look like for our organization. And if we can contextualize that, that's going to be really meaningful. And then we have to create the right systems to underpin all of that. And I'm not under the illusion that that's any small feat. This would be potentially a large scale build, and really something that you need to iterate over time as well as new things emerge. And so as you consider that from your perspective, really think about the systems and processes that you need to have to be successful. And ultimately, the more that this dynamism continues to grow in terms of stakeholders, I think if we set our North Star and we have the right systems in place, we're going to be much, much more effective as we look forward. And so that brings us back to the stove and focus question 3 and 4. Jim, I'll let you take it.
So as it's there's the stove. I like the can is written in French on the picture, which is great. Focus question number 3, how can all of the stakeholders benefit from the stove? So it's, as Jonathan mentioned, there are a number of stakeholders involved in getting the stove from A to B and making sure that, Jonathan's parents have a working and operable stove so he can be fed Sunday dinner, and which is important. And so that's one really big question, I think, is that important piece. And the second question 4 is what can you do to change your mindset to help advance to a better world? So this is the first part is like getting all the players together, and the second part is the sort of long-termism piece. I think those are key focus questions that fit well with this presentation, in the sense that you bring all the stakeholders together, as well as making sure that people have the mindset. So looking at our focus questions again, what stakeholders are relevant for your business today? This goes towards the capturing who, like, same as 10 years ago. Is it going to be the same 10 years from now? The seat at the table question, I think, is also fairly important. And Craig Fleischer made a great point about, the seat at the table. I'll just go back to it. Sorry, because it was an excellent piece. As usual, Craig, there's multiple things here, so I have to find them all.
So while Jim's looking for that, I would just encourage, these are really meant to be focus questions, but if you have thoughts on either these or some other elements and questions that have popped up, please do put them in the chat, and happy to explore that.
So yeah, so I found it, shockingly, and as this is an SLA presentation, and a lot of the people that are on the are information professionals and as well as intelligence practitioners. Craig's point is great. I mean, since there's such a critical role for intelligence practitioners to make sure their leadership is well informed about stakeholder development. So that's knowing who the stakeholder developments are, informs plans, strategies, tactics, operations. So if you're an info professional, this is one of the subject matter areas, intersections, that you can stand out, which is great because you can provide these insights. And the other thing where I got to when he talks about seat at the table, sort of the focus, he says you don't really need a seat at the table, but more strategically, your information may actually need to be the table. Your executives can't fly stakeholder blind anymore, if they ever did or could. I mean, so yeah, I mean, the fact that your information being the table, it's sorry, I'll just go back to my political days, and we see elections and stuff, and one of our key things is control the agenda. And if you're controlling the agenda about what people are talking about, your information is the table, not necessarily at the table. It's you're holding up the table. That's a key piece, but you have to know who else is supporting your agenda, who else can help with your agenda, or who's opposing your agenda.
Right.
And that's the key to the stakeholder piece. So,
and I think to that point as well, Jim, if we're going to be the table, recognizing the fast dynamics and exactly as you just said, who's on board, who's working against us, does this align? Like, there's a lot of moving pieces. So whether you need to be the table or have the ear of the people at the table, whatever that looks like, again, contextualize it for your organization. I would suggest that my takeaway from that would be, regardless of the chair element, your voice and your information needs to be present, understood, and actionable. And if we can do that, where we're in a position to create influence in a good way, that's positive from my perspective.
Well, here's a question. There's a couple of questions here.
Okay.
For you, and this is right up your alley, Jonathan. So the question is, what do you see as the nuances in the not-for-profit or economic development agencies, especially around the stakeholder piece? So I think you're well suited to.
Yes. So again, I would bring that back for context. My day job, I work as part of a nonprofit, and I interface with various government organizations, and so I do have a certain perspective on this. Again, I think it's so paramount to understand who are those stakeholders, how do they impact your success, what do you need to understand from them, and vice versa. And so that two-way relationship is so important. Again, I think I would reskin this as it's a lot of, it's a recalibration in many ways. The outputs that we might be looking at could be considerably different versus, say, a private enterprise. Private enterprise might be saying, well, we care about customers and competitors and regulators, those sorts of entities. When you start talking about economic development, the conversation is typically, how many jobs do you create? What are great exemplars that are out there in the world? What are best practices? It's those sorts of conversations. I know, Jim, as a former politico, that you have had many of those conversations. But to me, that's more, from my perspective, the types of things that I hear, where, again, it's what's the context, what do we care about? And when you talk about both economic development as well as nonprofit, Nonprofits that are not in economic development obviously have a different lens, but those two groupings, if they're in economic development, they typically want to have great alignment with the ECDEV agencies. And the more aligned that you can be, typically the more successful you're going to be.
Yeah, no, I'll just add to that as well. I think that
Sure.
one of the things to, particularly in this instance, because this is sort of the area that I focus in, is just to look at sort of the, particularly in economic, well, not-profit sphere too, but it's policy versus politics, and there is some difference in that. And I'll use an example which Richard Caldwell will appreciate. Here in Canada, we're looking to acquire new fighter jets for our military. The politics says, well, we can get the job creation if we go with this company, and the policy says, well, this is what our Air Force actually needs, right? So keeping the politics in play is also important as well. And I think that that's from an intelligence standpoint a key aspect to understand how those decisions are being made.
And that is a wonderful example when you talk about Canadian Forces procurement, needing to understand the stakeholders and get alignment across the board. That is a massive challenge and a huge opportunity. Are there other questions in the chat?
Oh, we have more actually.
Okay.
So the question is, what resources do you both recommend to read, to learn and understand more about engaging stakeholders more effectively?
So again, the stakeholder engagement piece is not my area of expertise. I'll be quite frank with that. So Jim, Craig, you may have some ideas as well, and there may be others in the room that have some suggestions on that, but not my area of expertise.
I'm gonna put a shameless plug in for my most recent blog post on article on LinkedIn on stakeholders, and the second pieces I am going to put forward is the article that was written for the Palgrave Encyclopedia of Lobbying Interest. I always mangle this, Craig, so please apologize. But the lobby interest groups, and by Austin Fleischer on stakeholder engagement. And then for sort of the background foundational piece, I would look at anything by Edward Freeman, who has sort of the basically founder guru of the whole stakeholder management, stakeholder management concept. Craig, if you have any other resources, that would be great to come on and share them with us.
No, those are great ones, guys. And yeah, R. Edward Freeman, who is kind of popularly known as the father or guru of stakeholder management back in the late 70s, early 80s. He's still writing actively on it, has a blog, and I do read it regularly. Another individual, I think, whose ideas and perspectives have greatly kind of moved stakeholder engagement and centricity forward is a fellow named Professor Archie Carroll, Carroll. He's probably, I think he may be the most cited person in the world on the topic, actually. And he talks a lot about some of you may be familiar with something called the pyramid of corporate social responsibility. And that's his concept. And it's a good one. I know if you were to go through any MBA program, at some point you would run across that. And it's probably taken on more interest than others. And Jim, you were right. There are about 24 entries in that Palgrave Encyclopedia of Interest Groups, Lobbying and Public Affairs. Jim Miller's name is attached to a couple of those. I'll note for the record, so he doesn't have to do it himself. They're really good. He's got a couple in there that I think are really important. But that idea of stakeholder engagement, stakeholder centricity, stakeholder capitalism, all of which are covered directly and all written from global authors over the last year and a half. So all fresh. And for those of you that want some analytic stuff in there, there's a couple of really good pieces too. And this is one of the things where I think information professionals can be so valuable. Is not only providing the information, or at least directing people to where the data sets exist, but more importantly, to help people make sense of it. Information professionals have a unique and valued role in that, and they need to step up. It's a place where they can add and demonstrate value, I think, very tangibly and quickly.
Thanks for that, Craig. Liz, Jim, how did you want to take this forward?
Well, Liz, you can come on because you're going to tell us about next and
Awesome.
just next month. But I just want to make a point of this, just as also from an SLA perspective, is that our next panelists, Zena, Phil, and Elise have written a book about this, which was sponsored by SLA, and this is, I think, the type of stuff SLA needs to be doing going forward to, share what our skill set is for our members. And so I think it's great that we're being able to take a leadership role from the SLA CI community to demonstrate this sort of information and these skills. So if you have a chance, get onto the next webinar, like as soon as you're off this one, sign up for the next one.
Well, and I think we made it even easier because we're running it as a series. So if you are on this list, we'll preserve that into the next and the following month. So as long as you don't choose to cancel on us, stay with us for the next edition, and we'll be bringing those insights to you. But I just want to thank you. I know we're over time. So Jim, Jonathan, this has been excellent. Thank you for your contributions to this conversation, to Craig, Edwin, Rich, Derek, everybody who's been asking questions out there. Thank you again. And if you're the lucky $25 winner, you'll hear from us, and we'll send out the link to the recording in a follow-up email in 24 hours. And it's always going to be on the SLA CIC YouTube channel. So we'll close out for the day, but thank you again, and we'll see you next month. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everyone.